The morning mist clung to the Charleston plantation like a shroud, thick and suffocating in the October air. Abigail wiped the sweat from her brow as she hung the last of the Whitmore family's linens on the line behind the slave quarters. The cotton fields stretched endlessly beyond the weathered wooden buildings, their white bowls ready for harvest under the pale southern sun. Rufus, her loyal hound, had been acting strange all morning. The brown and black mutt paced restlessly near the old well, whining and pawing at the ground with an urgency that made Abigail's stomach churn. She'd had him for 3 years now, ever since he wandered onto the plantation as a starving pup, and never once had she seen him behave this way. "What's got into you, boy?" she whispered, glancing nervously toward the main house. Master Thomas Whitmore didn't tolerate disruptions, especially not from his slaves' animals. Rufus ignored her gentle coaxing, his claws scraping frantically against the packed earth near the well's stone foundation. The structure had been abandoned for years, ever since the new well was dug closer to the main house. Weeds and kudzu had claimed it, making it a forgotten corner of the plantation that even the overseers rarely visited. Abigail knelt beside the dog, her calloused hands trembling as she tried to pull him away. But Rufus was determined, his powerful legs driving deeper into the soil. Dirt flew in all directions as he dug with the desperation of an animal possessed. "Stop that, Rufus. You're gonna get us both." Her words died in her throat as something white caught the morning light. Not the white of cotton or limestone, but something else entirely, something that made her blood run cold. A small bone, no bigger than her thumb, protruded from the disturbed earth. Abigail's hands shook as she brushed away more dirt, revealing more fragments. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the horrible truth began to take shape before her eyes. These weren't animal bones. They were too small, too delicate, too human. Wrapped around the tiny remains was a piece of fabric, once fine, but now stained and rotted. Even in its deteriorated state, she could make out the intricate embroidery, a pattern she recognized with growing horror. The Whitmore family crest, stitched in gold thread that had somehow survived 7 years in the South Carolina soil. But it was the final discovery that made Abigail's world tilt on its axis. Nestled among the bones was a small silver locket, its surface tarnished but still bearing the delicate engraving of a rose. She had seen that locket before, hanging around the neck of little Evelyn Whitmore on the day she disappeared. The same locket that Mistress Margaret claimed to have buried with her daughter's memory in the family cemetery. Abigail stumbled backward, her mind reeling. 7 years ago, when she was just 16 and new to the Whitmore plantation, she remembered the chaos that followed Evelyn's disappearance, the frantic searches, the accusations hurled at the slave quarters, the way the entire incident was suddenly swept under the rug as if it had never happened. Now she understood why. The sound of approaching footsteps made her blood freeze. Through the morning mist, she could see the imposing figure of Overseer Jackson making his rounds, his leather whip coiled at his side like a sleeping snake. If he found her here, with these bones, with this evidence. Abigail quickly scooped up the remains, wrapping them in her apron with shaking hands. Rufus whined softly, sensing her distress, but remained obediently silent as she filled in the hole with trembling fingers. "Come on, boy," she whispered urgently, pulling the dog away from the well. "We need to get back before—" "Abigail!" Jackson's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "What are you doing back there?" She turned slowly, forcing her face into a mask of submission while her heart threatened to burst from her chest. "Just hanging the wash, sir. Rufus got loose and I was fetching him back." Jackson's cold grey eyes swept over her, lingering on the dirt under her fingernails and the slight bulge in her apron. For a moment that felt like an eternity. She was certain he could see right through her lies. "Get that mutt under control," he growled finally, "and finish your work. Mistress Margaret wants the house spotless for tonight's dinner party." "Yes, sir," Abigail managed, her voice barely above a whisper. As Jackson's footsteps faded into the distance, Abigail clutched the bundle in her apron tighter. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her like a physical force. Little Evelyn Whitmore hadn't been kidnapped by slave catchers or wandered off into the swamps as everyone believed. She had been murdered, and someone in the big house knew exactly what had happened to her. The question that terrified Abigail most wasn't who had killed the child. It was what they would do to keep their secret buried. The slave quarters buzzed with nervous energy as evening fell over the plantation. Word traveled fast in the cramped wooden buildings that housed the Whitmore's 43 enslaved workers, and by sunset, everyone knew that Abigail had found something near the old well. She sat on her narrow cot in the cabin she shared with 3 other women, the bundle of bones hidden beneath her thin mattress. Her hands still trembled as she tried to process what she'd discovered. The other women, Sarah, an older house slave with graying hair, Mama Celia, the plantation's unofficial healer, and young Lily, barely 14, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "Child, you've been shaken like a leaf all day," Mama Celia said softly, her weathered face creased with concern. "What did that dog of yours dig up?" Abigail glanced toward the door, ensuring they were alone. The sounds of the plantation settling into evening drifted through the thin walls. Children playing in the dirt yards, men returning from the fields, women preparing meager suppers over small fires. "I can't tell you," she whispered. "It's too dangerous." Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely audible. "Dangerous how? What could be more dangerous than what we already face every day?" The weight of the secret pressed against Abigail's chest like a stone. These women had been her family for 7 years, the only family she'd known since being sold away from her mother's plantation in Virginia. If she couldn't trust them, she couldn't trust anyone. "Rufus found bones," she said finally, the words feeling like poison on her tongue. "Small bones, child-sized." The cabin fell silent except for the distant sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Lily's eyes widened with horror, while Sarah's face went ashen. But it was Mama Celia's reaction that chilled Abigail to the bone. The older woman's expression shifted from concern to something that looked almost like recognition. "Where?" Mama Celia asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "Near the old well, behind the quarters." Abigail pulled the bundle from beneath her mattress, unwrapping it carefully. The bones seemed to glow in the flickering candlelight, and the tarnished locket caught the flame's reflection like a malevolent eye. Mama Celia reached out with trembling fingers, touching the fabric with its embroidered crest. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. "I knew this day would come." "You knew?" Abigail stared at the older woman in shock. "Mama Celia, what do you know about this?" The healer's eyes were distant, lost in memories that seemed to cause her physical pain. 7 years ago, when little Miss Evelyn went missing, I was working in the herb garden behind the kitchen. It was late afternoon, and the child was playing in the rose garden like she always did. She paused, her voice growing quieter. I heard her scream, just once, but it was the kind of scream that cuts right through your soul. By the time I got to the garden, she was gone, but I saw someone walking away from the house toward the back of the property. "Who?" Sarah demanded. "Who did you see?" Mama Celia's hands shook as she wrapped the bones back in the fabric. "Master Thomas. He was carrying something wrapped in a blanket and his clothes. They were dirty like he'd been digging." The implications hit the cabin like a physical blow. Abigail felt sick to her stomach as the pieces began falling into place. The rushed investigation that went nowhere, the way the family suddenly stopped talking about Evelyn's disappearance, the convenient story about slave catchers that explained everything while explaining nothing. "But why?" Lily whispered, tears streaming down her young face. "Why would he hurt his own child?" "Money," Sarah said grimly. "It's always about money with these people. Maybe the child saw something she shouldn't have. Maybe she was in the way of something." Mama Celia shook her head slowly. "There's more to it than that. I've seen the way Master Thomas looks at his wife, the way he talks to her when he thinks no one's listening. There's hatred there, deep and poisonous. And little Miss Evelyn, she looked just like her mother." The cabin fell silent again as the women absorbed this information. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the evening meal being prepared, the normal rhythms of plantation life continuing, as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath their feet. "What do we do?" Abigail asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't go to the authorities. They'd never believe us, and even if they did, they'd kill us all to keep it quiet," Sarah finished grimly. "Every last one of us." Mama Celia stood slowly, her joints creaking with age and hard labor. "There's someone we need to talk to, someone who might know more about what happened that day." "Who?" "Old Moses. He was working the stables 7 years ago, before his back gave out. If anyone saw something, it would be him." She moved toward the door, then paused. "But we need to be careful. If Master Thomas killed his own child to keep a secret, he won't hesitate to kill us too." As the women prepared to seek out the old stable hand, none of them noticed the shadow that had been listening outside their window. A figure that melted back into the darkness between the buildings, carrying with it the knowledge that the plantation's deadliest secret was no longer buried. The hunt for the truth was about to become a fight for survival. Old Moses lived in a lean-to behind the abandoned tobacco barn, forgotten by most of the plantation, like the crop that had once made the Whitmores wealthy before cotton became king. His back had been broken by a horse's kick 3 years prior, leaving him bent and shuffling, useful only for mending harnesses and feeding chickens. The 4 women found him sitting on a 3-legged stool, working by lamplight to repair a bridle with gnarled fingers that still remembered their skill. His rheumy eyes looked up as they approached, and something in their expressions made him set down his tools. "Evening, ladies," he said carefully. Awful late for social calls. Mama Celia stepped forward, her voice low and urgent. "Moses, we need to talk to you about something that happened 7 years ago, about the day little Miss Evelyn disappeared." The old man's face went rigid and his hands began to shake. "I don't know nothing about that. Told the master so back then, and I'm telling you the same now." "Moses," Abigail said gently, kneeling beside his stool, "we found something today, something that proves what really happened to that child." She unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing the bones and the locket in the flickering lamplight. Moses stared at the remains for a long moment, his breathing becoming labored and shallow. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, "I prayed this day would never come." "You saw something," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Moses nodded slowly, tears beginning to track down his weathered cheeks. "I saw it all. Every damned thing. And I've been carrying it like a stone in my chest ever since." He struggled to his feet, moving to the small window that faced toward the main house. The mansion's windows glowed warmly in the distance, a picture of southern gentility that masked the horror within. "It was a Tuesday afternoon," Moses began, his voice barely audible. "Hot as blazes, and the horses were restless in the heat. I was in the stable when I heard voices coming from the rose garden, angry voices." The women gathered closer, hanging on every word. Master Thomas was shouting at little Miss Evelyn about something. The child was crying, saying she was sorry, that she didn't mean to tell, but he kept yelling, asking her who else she'd told, who else knew. "Knew what?" Lily whispered. Moses's hands clenched into fists. "About the money." The child had seen her father taking coins from her mother's jewelry box, the one with the secret compartment, Mistress Margaret's inheritance money that was supposed to be untouchable. The master had been stealing from it for months to cover his gambling debts. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. Thomas Whitmore had been embezzling his wife's inheritance, and his 7-year-old daughter had caught him in the act. "What happened next?" Mama Celia asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. "The child tried to run," Moses continued, his voice breaking. "But he caught her by the garden gate. I saw him grab her by the shoulders, shaking her, demanding to know if she'd told her mother. When she said no, that she was going to tell, he just lost his mind." Moses turned away from the window, unable to continue looking toward the house. "He hit her. Not a slap, but a real blow with his fist. The child went down like a sack of grain, her head hitting the stone border around the rosebed. There was blood, so much blood." Abigail felt bile rise in her throat. "She was dead?" "Not right away. She was breathing, but barely, making these awful sounds." Moses wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I wanted to help her. God knows I did. But I was just a slave, and he was the master. If I'd tried to interfere, he would have killed you too," Sarah said grimly. "Maybe. But I've wondered every day since if I could have saved her, if I'd been braver, stronger." Moses's voice trailed off into silence. "What did he do with her?" Mama Celia asked gently. "Wrapped her in a blanket from the garden shed. She was still breathing when he carried her away, but those sounds, they were getting weaker. I followed at a distance, staying in the shadows. He took her to the old well behind the quarters." The women exchanged horrified glances. The well where Rufus had been digging. "He dropped her down the well?" Abigail asked. Moses shook his head. "Worse, he laid her on the ground beside it and waited. Just sat there in the dirt, watching her die. It took maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When she finally stopped breathing, he dug a shallow grave right there and buried her." The brutality of it left them all speechless. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just killed his daughter in a moment of rage. He'd watched her die slowly, making sure she couldn't survive to tell anyone about his theft. "The search the next day," Sarah said. "The story about slave catchers, all lies," Moses confirmed. "He came to me that night, told me what story I was to tell if anyone asked, said if I ever breathed a word of what really happened, he'd have me hanged for touching his daughter. Who would believe a broken-down slave over a white master?" Mama Celia placed a comforting hand on the old man's shoulder. "You did what you had to do to survive, Moses. We all did. But now we know the truth," Abigail said, looking down at the bones in her lap. "The question is, what do we do with it?" Before anyone could answer, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching through the darkness, heavy boots on packed earth, moving with purpose toward the lean-to. "Someone's coming," Lily whispered urgently. Moses's face went white with terror. "Hide those bones, now!" Abigail quickly wrapped the remains and shoved them under a pile of old horse blankets, just as a figure emerged from the shadows. Overseer Jackson stepped into the circle of lamplight, his cold eyes scanning the group with suspicion. "What's all this?" he demanded. "Slaves aren't supposed to be gathering after dark." "Just helping Moses with some mending," Mama Celia said smoothly. "His hands aren't what they used to be." Jackson's gaze lingered on each of their faces, searching for signs of deception. "Well, you can help him tomorrow. Get back to your quarters. Now." As the women filed past him into the darkness, Jackson remained behind. Through the shadows, they could hear him questioning Moses in low, threatening tones. Whatever the old stable hand told him, it seemed to satisfy the overseer, because after a few minutes, Jackson's footsteps could be heard heading back toward the main house. But as Abigail clutched the hidden bones to her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that their secret was no longer safe. Someone was watching them, and time was running out. The truth about Evelyn Whitmore's death was spreading like wildfire through the quarters, and soon it would reach the ears of those who would kill to keep it buried. Margaret Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, staring out at the moonlit plantation grounds with eyes that had forgotten how to sleep. 7 years had passed since Evelyn's disappearance, but the grief remained as fresh and raw as an open wound. The official story, that her daughter had been taken by slave catchers, had never sat right with her, but Thomas had been so convincing, so certain in his explanations. Now, as she watched the shadows moving between the slave quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring in the darkness, something that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed life she'd built around her loss. The house felt different tonight. The servants moved with nervous energy, their eyes avoiding hers when she passed. Even Thomas seemed on edge, pacing the halls and snapping at the staff over minor infractions. It was as if the entire plantation was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. "Come in," she called, not turning from the window. Her personal maid, Sarah, entered carrying a tea service. The older woman's hands trembled slightly as she set the tray on the bedside table, and Margaret noticed the way she kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in. "Sarah," Margaret said gently, "you seem troubled tonight. Is everything all right?" The maid's composure cracked for just a moment, and Margaret caught a glimpse of something that looked like guilt in her eyes. "Just tired, mistress. It's been a long day." Margaret turned from the window, studying her maid's face in the lamplight. Sarah had been with the family for over a decade, arriving just a year before Evelyn was born. She'd helped raise the child, had been almost like a second mother to her. If anyone understood Margaret's pain, it was Sarah. "Do you ever think about her?" Margaret asked suddenly. "About Evelyn?" Sarah's hands stilled on the tea service. "Every day, mistress. I've been having dreams lately. Strange dreams where she's trying to tell me something, but I can't understand what she's saying." Margaret moved closer to the maid, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think it's possible that we never knew the whole truth about what happened to her?" The question hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Sarah's face went pale, and for a moment Margaret thought she might confess whatever secret she was clearly carrying. But then the moment passed, and the maid's expression returned to its usual mask of servitude. "I wouldn't know about such things, mistress. Perhaps you should speak with Master Thomas if you're having doubts." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Thomas? Yes, he always has such convenient answers, doesn't he? Always so certain about things he couldn't possibly know for sure." She moved to her jewelry box, the ornate wooden case that had belonged to her grandmother. Her fingers traced the familiar patterns carved into its surface, remembering how Evelyn used to love watching her mother's morning ritual, of selecting earrings and necklaces. "Sarah," she said without turning around, "do you remember the locket I used to let Evelyn wear? The silver one with the rose engraving?" "Yes, mistress. Thomas told me he buried it with her memory in the family cemetery. Said it would help me find peace." Margaret's voice hardened. "But I never gave him that locket. It was in this jewelry box the day she disappeared, and it's been here ever since." She opened the box and lifted the top tray, revealing the secret compartment beneath. The space where she kept her most precious jewelry and her inheritance money was nearly empty, far emptier than it should have been. "Someone has been stealing from me, Sarah, taking my inheritance money bit by bit, thinking I wouldn't notice." Margaret's hands shook as she counted the remaining coins. "And now I'm wondering what else they might have lied about." Sarah backed toward the door, her face a mask of terror. "Mistress, I should go. It's late, and—" "Stay." Margaret's voice carried the authority of generations of plantation mistresses. "I want to know what you're not telling me. What are the slaves whispering about in the quarters?" Before Sarah could answer, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Thomas's voice could be heard giving orders to someone, his tone sharp and urgent. Margaret moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. "Search every cabin if you have to," Thomas was saying. "Someone is spreading lies, and I want to know who." "What kind of lies, Master?" Jackson's voice responded. "The kind that could destroy this family. The kind that could see us all hanged if they reached the wrong ears." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She looked back at Sarah, who was now pressed against the far wall, her eyes wide with fear. "What lies, Sarah?" Margaret demanded. "What could possibly be so dangerous that Thomas would search the slave quarters in the middle of the night?" The maid's resolve finally crumbled. "They found something, mistress. Something that was buried near the old well." "What kind of something?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Bones. Small bones, and a locket with a rose on it." The room seemed to tilt around Margaret as the implications hit her. The locket she thought was safely hidden in her jewelry box. The bones of a child, buried where no child should be buried. The lies her husband had told her about their daughter's disappearance. "Where is this locket now?" she asked, her voice deadly calm. "I don't know, mistress, but the woman who found it, she's in terrible danger. They all are." Margaret moved to her wardrobe, pulling out a dark cloak. "Take me to her. Now." "Mistress, I can't. If Master Thomas finds out if my husband killed our daughter, then he's going to answer for it." Margaret's voice carried a cold fury that made Sarah step back. "And if he's planning to hurt innocent people to cover up his crime, then I'm going to stop him." She paused at the door, looking back at the jewelry box with its secret compartment. "How long has he been stealing from me, Sarah?" "Years, mistress, since before Miss Evelyn disappeared." Margaret nodded grimly. The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture so horrible she could barely comprehend it. Her husband had been embezzling her inheritance, their daughter had discovered his theft, and he had killed her to keep his secret safe. "Show me where they are," she said, pulling the cloak around her shoulders. "It's time for the truth to come to light." As they slipped out into the night, neither woman noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the main staircase. Thomas Whitmore had heard every word of their conversation, and his face was a mask of cold calculation. The hunt for the truth was about to become a race against time, with lives hanging in the balance. Thomas Whitmore stood in his study, loading his pistol with steady hands, despite the rage burning in his chest. 7 years of careful planning, 7 years of maintaining the perfect lie, and now it was all unraveling because of a damned dog and some meddling slaves. Jackson stood before the massive oak desk, his hat in his hands and sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool October night. "The slaves are scattered, Master. Seems like word got out that we were coming. Found most of the cabins empty, and the bones. No sign of them. But we found evidence someone had been digging near the old well. Fresh dirt disturbed ground." Jackson shifted uncomfortably. "Master, if what they found is what I think it is—" "You don't think, Jackson. You follow orders." Thomas's voice was ice cold as he holstered the loaded weapon. "How many of them know?" "Hard to say. Could be a handful. Could be half the quarters. You know how fast word travels among them." Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the plantation grounds. Torches flickered between the buildings as his men searched for the escaped slaves. In the distance, he could see lights moving through the cotton fields, his human property fleeing into the night, carrying with them the power to destroy everything he'd built. What about my wife? Jackson's face went pale. She's gone too, Master. Sarah's cabin is empty and the mistress's bedroom door is standing open. Looks like they left together. The news hit Thomas like a physical blow. Margaret knew. Somehow she'd learned the truth about what happened to Evelyn, and now she was out there in the darkness with the very people who could testify against him. How many men do we have? 8, counting myself. But Master, if we start killing slaves, people are going to ask questions. The neighbors, the authorities. Thomas turned from the window, his eyes blazing with desperate fury. There won't be any questions if there's no one left to answer them. A fire, Jackson. A terrible accident that claims the slave quarters and everyone in them. These old wooden buildings, dry as kindling in this heat. Master, you're talking about 40 people, women and children. I'm talking about survival. Thomas slammed his fist on the desk, making the lamp flame flicker. Do you think they'll spare us if this gets out? Do you think the good people of Charleston will care that I was protecting my family's honor? They'll hang us both, Jackson, and our families will be ruined forever. Jackson stared at his employer with growing horror. He'd known Thomas Whitmore was capable of cruelty. All plantation owners were, but this was something else entirely. This was madness. There has to be another way, Jackson said quietly. There is no other way. Thomas pulled out the pistol again, pointing it directly at his overseer. You're either with me or you're against me. And if you're against me, you're just another loose end that needs to be tied up. Jackson raised his hands slowly, his mind racing. He'd suspected for years that there was more to Evelyn Whitmore's disappearance than the official story suggested. The child had been too smart, too observant, and Thomas had been too quick with his explanations. But he'd never imagined the truth was this dark. I'm with you, Master, he said finally. What do you want me to do? Thomas lowered the weapon, but kept it ready. Take half the men and start setting fires. Make it look like an accident. Overturned lanterns, cooking fires that got out of control. I'll take the others and hunt down the ones who escaped. And if we find them, we make sure they never make it to town. Thomas's voice was flat, emotionless. All of them, Jackson. My wife included. The overseer felt sick to his stomach, but he nodded. He had a family of his own to protect, and crossing Thomas Whitmore was a death sentence. Yes, Master. As Jackson left to gather the men, Thomas remained in his study, staring at a portrait of Evelyn that hung above the fireplace. The child's painted eyes seemed to follow him, accusing and sorrowful. I'm sorry, baby girl, he whispered to the image, but Daddy has to protect what's left of our family. He turned away from the portrait and began gathering important documents from his safe. If tonight went badly, he might need to disappear quickly, and he'd need money and papers to start over somewhere else. Outside, the hunt was beginning in earnest. Men with torches and weapons spread out across the plantation, searching every hiding place, every shadow where a terrified slave might seek refuge. The night air filled with the sound of barking dogs and shouted orders. But in the cotton fields beyond the main buildings, a different kind of gathering was taking place. Led by Mama Celia and guided by Margaret Whitmore herself, the escaped slaves were making their way toward the main road and the town beyond. They carried with them the bones of a murdered child and the testimony that would bring down one of Charleston's most prominent families. The race was on, between Thomas's desperate attempt to silence the truth and the survivors' determination to see justice done. In the darkness of the South Carolina night, the fate of everyone on the Whitmore plantation hung in the balance. The sins of the past were finally coming home to roost, and blood would be spilled before the sun rose again. The acrid smell of smoke began to drift across the plantation as Jackson's men set their fires with methodical precision. The old slave quarters, built of dry pine and weathered by decades of southern heat, caught flame with terrifying speed. Orange light danced against the night sky, and the sound of crackling wood mixed with the distant barking of search dogs. Margaret Whitmore pressed herself against the trunk of an ancient oak tree, her heart pounding as she watched her husband's men systematically destroy the evidence of their community. Beside her, Abigail clutched the bundle of bones to her chest while Mama Celia whispered prayers in the darkness. How many made it out? Margaret asked Sarah, who had been counting heads as the slaves fled into the cotton fields. Most of them, Sarah replied, her voice tight with fear. But old Moses, his legs couldn't carry him fast enough. And there are children missing, little ones who got separated in the confusion. The sound of screaming carried across the night air, and Margaret's blood turned to ice. Through the smoke and flames, she could see figures running between the burning buildings, some carrying bundles, others helping the elderly and infirm escape the inferno. "We have to help them," Margaret said, starting to rise from their hiding place. Mama Celia grabbed her arm firmly. "No, mistress. You go back there now. You'll just get yourself killed. And then who's going to tell the truth about what happened to your baby girl?" The older woman was right, but it didn't make watching the destruction any easier. Margaret had lived her entire life in the comfort of the big house, insulated from the harsh realities of plantation life. Now she was seeing the true cost of her husband's desperation, innocent people burning alive to protect his secrets. "There," Abigail whispered urgently, pointing toward the main road. "Someone's coming." Through the smoke and darkness, they could see torches approaching from the direction of town. A group of riders, moving fast toward the plantation. Margaret's heart leaped with hope. Perhaps someone had seen the fires and come to help. But as the riders drew closer, her hope turned to dread. These weren't rescuers. They were Thomas's men, returning from their search with grim expressions and blood on their clothes. "They found someone," Sarah said quietly. "God help us. They found someone." The lead rider dismounted near the burning quarters, and even from their hiding place, they could hear his report to Thomas, who had emerged from the main house to survey the destruction. "Found 3 of them hiding in the tobacco barn," the man called out. "The old stable hand and 2 women. They put up a fight." Margaret closed her eyes, knowing without being told that Moses was dead. The old man who had carried the burden of Evelyn's murder for 7 years had finally paid the ultimate price for his knowledge. "What about the others?" Thomas's voice carried clearly across the night air. "What about my wife?" "Still searching, Master, but they can't have gone far on foot." Thomas nodded grimly, then turned to address the men gathered around him. "Burn everything. The quarters, the barns, the cotton stores. Make it look like the slaves started the fires during an uprising. When the authorities arrive, we'll tell them we barely escaped with our lives." Margaret felt sick as she realized the full scope of her husband's plan. He wasn't just covering up Evelyn's murder. He was committing genocide to do it. Every slave on the plantation would be branded as rebels, their deaths justified as necessary to maintain order. "We have to get to town," she whispered urgently. "We have to tell someone what's really happening here." Mama Celia nodded, but her expression was grim. "Town's 5 miles through open country, and they got dogs tracking us." "Then we split up," Abigail said suddenly. "Make them choose who to follow. Some of us might make it through." It was a desperate plan, but it was their only chance. Margaret looked around at the small group of survivors, maybe a dozen people, including herself. Not enough to fight Thomas's men, but perhaps enough to ensure that at least one person reached safety with the truth. "I'll take the bones," Margaret said, reaching for the bundle in Abigail's arms. "If anyone has a chance of being believed by the authorities, it's me." Abigail hesitated, then handed over the precious evidence. "Be careful, mistress. Those bones are the only proof we have." Margaret tucked the bundle inside her cloak, feeling the weight of her daughter's remains against her chest. 7 years of grief and guilt had led to this moment, a desperate flight through the darkness, carrying the evidence of her husband's ultimate betrayal. "Sarah, take half the group and head for the river," she instructed. "Follow it downstream to the ferry crossing. Mama Celia, take the others and circle around through the pine woods. I'll go straight for the main road." "Mistress, you can't go alone," Sarah protested. "I have to. If we're all captured together, the truth dies with us." Margaret squeezed the older woman's hand. "Tell them about the money he stole. Tell them about the locket. Make them understand that this was never about slave rebellion. It was about a man who killed his own child to hide his crimes." The sound of approaching dogs grew louder, and they could see torches moving through the cotton fields, getting closer to their hiding place. "Go!" Margaret whispered urgently. "All of you, go now." As the group scattered into the darkness, Margaret began her own desperate journey toward town. Behind her, the Whitmore plantation burned like a vision of hell, the flames reaching toward the stars as if trying to carry the souls of the innocent to heaven. She ran through the night with her daughter's bones pressed against her heart, knowing that she carried not just evidence of murder, but the hopes of everyone who had died to keep that evidence safe. The race against time had become a race against death itself, and the finish line was still miles away. The first light of dawn was breaking over Charleston when Margaret Whitmore stumbled through the doors of the sheriff's office, her dress torn and stained with smoke, her hands bleeding from thorns and brambles. Sheriff William Crawford looked up from his morning coffee, startled by the appearance of one of the county's most prominent ladies in such a disheveled state. "Mrs. Whitmore, good Lord, what's happened to you?" Margaret collapsed into a chair, her strength finally giving out after the harrowing night. "Sheriff Crawford, I need to report a murder, multiple murders, and I have proof." Crawford's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "Ma'am, I think you might be in shock. Perhaps we should get you to a doctor." "My husband killed our daughter," Margaret said, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade. 7 years ago, when Evelyn disappeared, Thomas murdered her and buried her body on our plantation. And last night he killed innocent people to cover up his crime. The sheriff stared at her in stunned silence. The Whitmores were one of the most respected families in Charleston society. The idea that Thomas could be capable of such acts seemed impossible. "Mrs. Whitmore, these are very serious accusations." Margaret pulled the bundle from her cloak, unwrapping it carefully on the sheriff's desk. The small bones gleamed white in the morning light, and the tarnished locket caught the sun streaming through the window. "This is my daughter," she said simply. "These are her remains found buried near the slave quarters, and this is the locket Thomas claimed to have buried with her memory, the same locket that was in my jewelry box the day she disappeared." Crawford leaned forward, his face pale as he examined the evidence. The bones were unmistakably those of a child, and the locket bore the Whitmore family crest. "How did you come by these remains?" "A slave's dog dug them up yesterday morning. When the slaves realized what they'd found, Thomas tried to kill them all to keep them quiet. He burned the quarters, Sheriff, murdered innocent people and tried to make it look like a slave uprising." Before Crawford could respond, the office door burst open. Deputy Marshal James Harrison strode in, his face grim with news. "Sheriff, we've got a situation at the Whitmore plantation. The whole place is burning, and there are bodies." He stopped short when he saw Margaret sitting at the desk, then noticed the bones laid out before them. "Mrs. Whitmore, we thought you were... that is, your husband said you were killed in the uprising." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I'm sure he did. What did he tell you happened?" Harrison glanced uncertainly between Margaret and the sheriff. "He said the slaves revolted in the night, set fire to their own quarters, and tried to burn down the main house. Said they killed you and several others before he and his men could restore order." "And how many slaves died in this uprising?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer would break her heart. 37 so far. Men, women, children. Your husband said they were all part of the rebellion." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those deaths settling on her shoulders. 37 innocent people, murdered to hide one man's crimes. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I need to tell you everything. About the money Thomas stole from my inheritance, about what really happened to Evelyn, about the witnesses who saw him kill her." For the next hour, Margaret laid out the entire story. She told them about Moses's testimony, about the theft from her jewelry box, about Thomas's desperate attempt to silence anyone who knew the truth. Crawford and Harrison listened in growing horror as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "We need to arrest him immediately," Crawford said finally, "before he has a chance to destroy any more evidence." "He's already destroyed the most important evidence," Margaret replied sadly. "The people who could testify against him are dead, burned alive in their own homes." "Not all of them," a voice said from the doorway. They turned to see Sarah standing in the entrance, supported by 2 other women Margaret recognized from the plantation. Behind them, Deputy Harrison's partner was helping an injured man into the office. "Sarah!" Margaret rose from her chair, relief flooding through her. "Thank God you made it." "Some of us did," Sarah said grimly. "Mama Celia got shot trying to help the children escape, but she's alive, and we found this man hiding in the swamps." The injured man looked up and Margaret gasped. It was Jackson, Thomas's overseer, but his face was battered and his clothes were torn. "He came to us during the night," Sarah explained. "Said he couldn't be part of what Master Thomas was planning. Said he wanted to tell the truth about what happened." Crawford looked at Jackson with suspicion. "You were part of this conspiracy?" Jackson nodded weakly. "I knew something wasn't right about the child's disappearance, but I was scared, and Thomas, he has a way of making people do things they don't want to do." "But you're willing to testify now?" "Yes, sir. About the money he stole, about the lies he told, about the orders he gave last night. All of it." Margaret felt a surge of hope. With Jackson's testimony and the physical evidence of Evelyn's remains, they might actually be able to bring Thomas to justice. "Where is he now?" Crawford asked. "Still at the plantation," Jackson replied, "waiting for you to arrive so he can play the grieving widower whose wife was killed by rebellious slaves." Crawford stood, reaching for his gun belt. "Then let's not keep him waiting." As the group prepared to return to the plantation, Margaret took one last look at her daughter's bones. 7 years of grief and guilt were finally coming to an end, but the cost had been terrible. 37 innocent people had died to uncover the truth about one little girl's murder. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered to the remains. "Mama's sorry it took so long." The sun was fully up now, painting the Charleston sky in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a beautiful day, the first day of justice for Evelyn Whitmore and all the innocent souls who had died protecting her memory. As they rode toward the plantation, Margaret could see smoke still rising from the ruins of the slave quarters, but she could also see something else. A group of survivors emerging from the woods, people who had hidden through the night and lived to tell their stories. The truth was finally coming to light, and no amount of fire or blood could bury it again. Thomas Whitmore's reign of terror was about to end, and the ghosts of his victims would finally find peace. Epilogue: The Weight of Truth. 6 months later. The Charleston courthouse was packed to capacity as Judge Samuel Morrison read the verdict in the case of the state of South Carolina versus Thomas Whitmore. Margaret sat in the front row, dressed in black mourning clothes that she would wear for the rest of her life. Not for her husband, but for the daughter whose justice had finally come. "On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Evelyn Whitmore," Judge Morrison's voice rang out clearly, "we find the defendant guilty." A murmur ran through the courtroom, but Margaret felt only a hollow satisfaction. Thomas would hang for his crimes, but it wouldn't bring back Evelyn or the 37 slaves who had died to protect her memory. The trial had been a sensation throughout the South. The story of a plantation owner who murdered his own child and then committed genocide to cover it up had shocked even a society accustomed to violence. Newspapers from Richmond to New Orleans had covered every detail, and the case had become a symbol of the corruption that lay beneath the veneer of Southern gentility. Jackson's testimony had been devastating. The former overseer had described in detail how Thomas had stolen from his wife's inheritance, how he had killed Evelyn when she discovered his theft, and how he had orchestrated the massacre at the slave quarters. Sarah and the other survivors had corroborated his account, painting a picture of a man so consumed by greed and desperation that he had lost all humanity. The physical evidence had been equally damning. The bones found by Rufus had been examined by doctors who confirmed they belonged to a 7-year-old girl who had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The locket had been identified by multiple witnesses as belonging to Evelyn, and the embroidered fabric bore the unmistakable Whitmore family crest. On the charges of murder in the deaths of Moses Williams, Rebecca Johnson, and Mary Patterson, the judge continued, we find the defendant guilty. Those were just 3 of the slaves who had been identified among the burned remains. The others had been too badly damaged by the fire to determine individual identities, but their deaths weighed just as heavily on Margaret's conscience. Thomas Whitmore, Judge Morrison said, looking directly at the defendant, you have been found guilty of multiple counts of murder, arson, and conspiracy. You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn on the 15th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1859. Thomas showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming that the slaves had killed his daughter and that he had acted in self-defense during the uprising. But the evidence against him had been overwhelming, and the jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours. As the courtroom began to empty, Margaret remained in her seat, staring at the man she had once loved. 7 years of marriage, and she had never truly known him. The charming gentleman who had courted her, the devoted father who had played with Evelyn in the garden, it had all been a mask hiding a monster. Mrs. Whitmore? Sheriff Crawford approached her gently. Are you all right? Margaret nodded slowly. I keep thinking about that day. If I had been watching more carefully, if I had noticed the money missing sooner, maybe Evelyn would still be alive. You can't blame yourself for his actions, Crawford said firmly. Thomas Whitmore made his choices. The responsibility lies with him alone. Margaret knew he was right, but the guilt would never fully leave her. She had been so focused on maintaining the perfect plantation lifestyle that she had failed to see the darkness growing in her own home. Outside the courthouse, a small group of survivors from the plantation waited for her. Sarah was there, along with Mama Celia, who walked with a cane now due to her injuries from that terrible night. Abigail stood beside them, holding the hand of a young boy, her son born free in the month since the trial began. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked as they walked together toward the carriage. Margaret had been asking herself the same question for months. The plantation was gone, destroyed by fire and scandal. Her inheritance was nearly depleted, spent on legal fees and compensation for the families of the murdered slaves. She was a widow at 32, with no children and no home. "I've been thinking about going north," she said finally. "There are people there who are working to end slavery. Maybe I can help them in some small way. Maybe I can make sure that what happened at our plantation never happens again." Mama Celia smiled sadly. "Miss Evelyn would be proud of that. She always had a good heart, that child." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "I hope so. I hope she can forgive me for not protecting her." "She already has," Mama Celia said with certainty. "Children always forgive their parents. It's the way of things." As they reached the carriage, Margaret turned to look back at the courthouse one last time. Thomas was being led away in shackles, his head held high despite his circumstances. Even now, facing death, he showed no remorse for what he had done. "Mrs. Whitmore," Abigail said quietly, "there's something I want you to have." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden carving, a dog, roughly hewn, but clearly made with love. "Rufus died last month, old age," the vet said, "but before he passed, I had this made. He was the one who found Miss Evelyn, who brought the truth to light. I thought you should have something to remember him by." Margaret accepted the carving with trembling hands. Such a small thing, this wooden dog, but it represented so much. The courage of the slaves who had risked everything to seek justice. The love of a mother who had never stopped searching for answers. The innocence of a child whose death had exposed the rot at the heart of their society. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." As the carriage pulled away from the courthouse, Margaret clutched the wooden dog to her chest and watched Charleston fade into the distance. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, her home, her social position, her entire way of life. But she was also leaving behind the lies and the guilt and the terrible weight of secrets. For the first time in 7 years, she felt free. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing, their clear notes carrying across the city like a song of redemption. Margaret closed her eyes and listened, imagining that she could hear her daughter's laughter mixed in with the sound. The truth had finally set them all free.